Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever GovernMax live stream. I am Max Rudin, your host, and you may know me from the Gravity Max live stream that I host with my co-host Sebastian every Sunday at 5 p.m. So why am I streaming on a Friday at 5 p.m.? Well, the answer is that I am launching a monthly live stream about the federal government and what actions the federal government has taken in the past month. So that is the focus of this live stream, and give me a second to make sure everything is running smoothly. Let's see. So let me explain, I guess, what I'm doing here. All right, everything looks good. Okay, so the focus of this channel, you may have noticed the videos I put up where I read legislation, executive orders, and Supreme Court opinions. And that is the primary focus of this channel. It is the actual process of government, the actual actions that politicians take in their official capacity. And the reason that I feel that this is needed is that a lot of news about politics is centered around the scandals and the chaos and just the bickering that surrounds politics, and it is a chaotic time. However, I think that the day-to-day actions of the government does not get enough press. A lot of laws pass without really much attention, and fair enough, a lot of them you'll come to see are fairly rote, just fairly routine, and it's fine, but I think it's important to get a healthy amount of both. The scandals are important because you want to know if your representatives are crooked or not, but it is also important to keep an eye on what they are actually doing. Otherwise, you could end up just sort of getting into tribal partisan arguments that don't actually mean anything. I think once we actually get into policy, we'll find a lot more in common than we'd expect. So that is the focus of this YouTube channel. It's just about policy and how it affects our lives, like what is changing. So yeah, let's just get started. So we begin with the legislative branch. The legislative branch of the government is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And there are 435 representatives and 100 senators. And this bicameral sort of legislature can be fairly slow in passing laws. In fact, this month, the legislature only passed one public law. However, they did have more internal resolutions. So the House can pass rules relating to the House, and the Senate can pass rules relating to the Senate. That makes sense. They don't need the approval of the other generally for most things. And as this was the first month of the 117th Congress, a new Congress was sworn in, it makes sense that not as much is getting done because there is a lot of routine, a lot of sort of run-of-the-mill activities, pro forma is what it's called, that needs to get done before they can really get into action and start passing laws. But yeah, so let's get right into it. So we begin with electing a speaker. This, I believe, is the first action that a House takes. I'm not sure, I think even before swearing in, because I think the House Speaker has to swear people in. But it's one of the earliest activities. And Nancy Pelosi, who was the House Speaker for the 116th Congress, won again, and she will continue to serve as House Speaker. She got 216 votes. The runner-up was Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who got 209 votes. He is a Republican. That's what the colors indicate here. Pelosi, Democrat, McCarthy, a Republican. And you can see that this is a very close margin, and this just reflects the fact that Republicans made like half a dozen seats, like 10, really 10-ish seats. They gained quite a few seats in the House, but they still did not gain a majority of the House. Last session, there were 233 Democrats in the House, I believe, 235, somewhere around there, and now it is closer to 220. So these are very slim margins. 218 are needed for a majority, but Pelosi got the plurality of votes rather than the majority because a few Democrats decided to just vote for other people. These two people here, Congresswoman Duckworth and Congressman Jeffries, are other party officials in the Democratic Party in the House. They are like the whip, I believe, but they are like they have positions. So people voted for them. Each of them got one vote from other Democratic Congress people that didn't want Pelosi to be the speaker. But that was a very small portion of the Democratic Party, so Pelosi got to be speaker. A ton of people also didn't vote at all as well. That's why the number doesn't add up to 435, but also some members haven't been seated yet. There are still ongoing disputes with, I believe, one election in New York and one election in Iowa. So the number is at 433. There's just court cases that need to be sorted out between who won those elections. So next we have House Resolution 8. Now, I don't cover every single House resolution or Senate resolution because that would be a lot of reading and covering, but the important ones I think deserve a little attention. So House Resolution 8 establishes the rules of the 117th Congress. And you can see that it starts with Section 1, Adoption of the Rules of the 116th Congress, which you may think is a typo, but no, it actually makes a lot of sense. The Congress decided to adopt the rules of the last Congress and then make a few changes, which makes quite a bit of sense instead of starting from scratch every time. So some changes that they made included, changes to language used in bills, changes to hiring practices to promote diversity, and they've also got about whistleblowers, just a few administrative procedures. And again, the reason that this is just a House resolution and it does not need any Senate approval, it does not need to be signed by the president, is that it only regards actions taken within the House of Representatives. This is not a law that affects the American people. I mean, it indirectly does because it affects our representatives, but it's not a law that's being put into place that you have to follow, which is why it does not need approval from the other sections of government, which makes a lot of sense. So the House is able to govern itself, essentially. And this was also passed very early on. You can see the date, January 4th. So yeah, that's it here. Yeah, so next we have counting the Electoral College votes. So this is done in a joint session of Congress. This is the House and the Senate. They get together and they read off the votes and tally up the votes from the Electoral College. And they can also, congressmen and senators can also object to certain states' votes in the Electoral College. Usually that does not happen. But that happened this time due to just sort of controversies over the election. Everyone is very heated right now. And so, let's see. So this process has been used in the past during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, which was a very long time ago. I believe one election, it was Louisiana, Arkansas, like they weren't counted. Because there was a lot of, in the South in particular during this time period, there was a lot of meddling with the voting processes of these states, preventing African Americans from voting. And so the Congress threw out these votes, saying these are invalid. So this has happened in the past, but it's sort of, it doesn't really fit, I guess, with a modern context, is the primary objection that people have to this objection process. And yeah, but this was supposed to just sort of go off without a hitch. This was January 6th, but they were unfortunately interrupted. Now, because of the nature of this channel, right, I don't really feel the need to go into the cause of the interruption that much. If you want to know about that, you already know about that, I'm guessing. You can look at any news channel, right? The point of this channel is just about the process. The scandal is everywhere else. I mean, it was pretty ridiculous, very ridiculous, I will say, what happened on January 6th. But regardless, in terms of the process of certifying, counting the Electoral College votes, it caused the Congress to have a recess until 3 a.m. when the Capitol could be cleared of people and was safe again for the politicians to continue the process. And yeah, they returned at 3 a.m. and objections that had been raised were resolved and the Electoral College was counted. So that went off, you know, not without a hitch. There was a hitch, but it got done successfully, at least, which is the important part about, you know, a democratic republic, a constitutional republic. So very, very nice. So yes, the counting of the Electoral College votes confirmed that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would be sworn in as president and vice president on January 20th. So yeah, that's all that really happened here. And it's funny that I'm not covering this that much because, again, they mentioned on the news, usually what happens with counting the Electoral College votes is that there's just no objections. Usually it just goes smoothly. You know, usually they just count the votes and they're out. Just a quick thing that barely takes any time. But due to the divisiveness this time around, objections were raised and then political violence occurred. And unfortunately, that slowed down the process and made this, the counting of the Electoral College, a much bigger deal than it really had to be, and a much bigger deal than it really used to be. It was never this big of a deal. So that's why that just seems such a brief thing to cover. So next is House Resolution 24. Now this is another important House resolution because it is a resolution that is impeaching Donald Trump in relation to the events described during the counting of the Electoral College. So this is historical because this is the second time Donald Trump has been impeached and the fourth time a president has been impeached in U.S. history, so it's very rare that this happens, but yeah, the House of Representatives, you can see there's one article of impeachment here. The last impeachment of Donald Trump had 2 articles, but this is just one article of impeachment, which is incitement of insurrection. So the House claims that Donald Trump incited an insurrection on January 6th based on the people, his supporters, that ended up, you know, entering the Capitol illegally and being generally violent, causing chaos. This is claiming that Donald Trump incited the insurrection, and that is a fine legal definition. That is what is going to end up being argued over in the Senate, is the extent to which he is responsible for this incident. So there are 2 arguments here. It's really a sliding scale of arguments, which is how much did his rhetoric, did his language cause this violence? Because nothing he said directly incited violence, and the definition of inciting violence in a legal sense is that you explicitly tell someone I want you to commit an illegal act. And of course, the president, or former president, did not do that. However, it can be argued that the words he used were intentionally inflammatory. For instance, Rudy Giuliani said he wanted trial by combat, which, his defenders would say that is just a figure of speech, whereas his opponents would say that is, inciting violence. Trump said on Twitter at one point, it's going to be wild at the Capitol. Again, it's one of those up to interpretation things, and that is what you can expect to be argued in the Senate in the coming month. So, yeah, this impeachment was voted in favor of by about 230 representatives. 10 of them were Republicans, which is fairly bipartisan for an impeachment vote. However, of course, there are hundreds of Republicans that voted no for impeachment. So it's not like crazily bipartisan. It's for an impeachment vote. It is a very bipartisan impeachment. And so, yes, this one article of impeachment was sent to the Senate and received, and I will get to this later, but senators have been sworn in for the trial, and the trial is going to occur starting on February 9th, but we'll get to that in a second. All right, so next we have Public Law 117-1. So this is the first public law of the year of the legislative session, which is pretty cool. And this public law is simply providing an exception to a rule. I believe it's within, so it's Title 10 of United States Code. Let me look that up for you. But basically, this piece of legislation, this former piece of legislation, says that nobody can serve as Secretary of Defense within 7 years of being a commissioned officer in the United States military. And so this is Section 113A that says this. Let me just pull this up for you guys 1 second. All right. Okay, how do I get this? Sorry for the delay. I'm just trying to get this up on screen. For the past little while, Sebastian has been on the live stream on the GovernMax channel, been doing the live stream for me, so that's made it easier. But okay, here we go. So 10 U.S. Code 113. A, there is a Secretary of Defense who is the head of the Department of Defense appointed from civilian life by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. A person may not be appointed as Secretary of Defense within 7 years after relief from active duty as a commissioned officer of a regular component of an armed force. So, yeah, that's basically the law that this law was providing an exception to, because General Lloyd Austin, who is now the Secretary of Defense for Joe Biden, he was in the military, he was a general within the past 7 years. So this piece of legislation, Title 10 United States Code, would preclude him from being the Secretary of Defense. However, the House and Senate and then the President passed this law to provide a one-time exception to General and now Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to be appointed as the Secretary of Defense. So this is just interesting because this does not mean that from now on people can be appointed Secretary of Defense after, being in the military within 7 years. This is a one-time exception. That is Section B. You see, it says this law only applies to the first person appointed to the position. So this law essentially is already moot, which is pretty funny. And I've highlighted it in yellow. Oh yes, I have a whole color scheme I forgot to mention. But the other House resolutions were highlighted in yellow. Yellow is for generally regulatory and economic things. It's sort of a miscellaneous category, but once we get to Joe Biden's executive orders, you will see more different colors in there just about the different sort of topics that his policies cover. But anyway, so yeah, this public law is already essentially meaningless. Not meaningless, but it has no power ever again, which is just sort of funny. But this is the kind of thing that Congress often passes. You'll see in the future, I am very excited to read some of these. I can't wait to get to an airport renaming or a post office renaming, because a lot of laws are just, this post office has been renamed, and it's kind of funny. But it is interesting from a sort of political perspective of how you might think of this sort of bill, right? Is that, well, it's just interesting because the Title 10 United States Code right here can simply be overwritten by a majority of the House and the Senate, and then, of course, the President. But the reason that I find it interesting is that cabinet appointments are usually just confirmed by the Senate. It usually just takes a majority of the Senate to confirm a cabinet appointee. However, the effect of the Title 10 United States Code, as well as the fact that they can pass this law, is it makes it so that for secretaries of defense that have been in the armed forces within 7 years, they need the approval of both the House and the Senate, which I just find interesting as a way to just sort of, like, I don't think the law, the Title 10 United States Code, was actually intended to prevent anyone from becoming Secretary of Defense within 7 years of serving in the armed forces. I think its actual purpose was precisely what is going on now. It's just they want an extra level of scrutiny for individuals who have served in the armed forces within the last 7 years, which is just pretty fascinating in terms of a sort of state building, statecraft policy. I think it makes sense. I just think it's fascinating. But yeah, that was the first law of this legislative session. I believe the 116th Congress, its first law of its legislative session, was actually related to the 30-day government shutdown that occurred. So I would say that was a more impactful law, but again, pretty mundane thing right here. All right, next. As I said, confirming cabinet appointments. So this is the job of the Senate, and they have confirmed 4 appointments so far. First, they confirmed the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. This is a cabinet-level position, but not technically a position in the cabinet. It's because Director of National Intelligence isn't a post that is commanding an official executive department. It's just a helpful post, essentially. Whereas the other confirmed appointees are the heads of different executive departments. Primarily, we have 3 out of the 4 core executive departments, and that is Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of Defense. All we are missing is the Attorney General, which will be Merrick Garland, who was, interestingly, that was Obama's Supreme Court pick for the end of his term. That never actually got to serve on the Supreme Court, which is pretty fascinating that he, popped up again. But yeah, so the other people, we have Secretary of State Antony Blinken, we have Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So Lloyd Austin is the one who the last law is related to. He had been in the armed forces, within the past 7 years, and now he is Secretary of Defense. And then the other people here, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, his history is he was Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. So it makes sense, nothing radical here. And then Janet Yellen, she was in charge of the Federal Reserve at one point, which, here, I'm just trying to confirm something. I want to make sure Antony Blinken was actually the Deputy Secretary of State. Don't want to have gotten that wrong. Yeah, Deputy Secretary of State. So, yeah, so Janet Yellen was the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is sort of like separate from the US government a little bit, but it manages the money supply. They set the interest rates for the banks, so they give the banks loans at certain interest rates, and when the economy is doing well, they have higher interest rates, and then when the economy is doing poorly, they have lower interest rates, which is just sort of an effort to minimize the negative effects of a poor economy. So when the economy is doing poorly, they lower the interest rate, and they're able to do that because they have high interest rates during the periods of, good times. So yeah, Treasury, it makes sense. She has dealt with money a lot, so yeah, so that makes sense. But yeah, it's interesting. So these are 3 out of the 4 core executive departments, and the reason I call these the core executive departments is that they are the 4 original executive departments, going all the way back to George Washington himself. George Washington had a 4-person cabinet, which was simply Department of State, Department of the Treasury, Department of War instead of Department of Defense. They rebranded it, and then Department of Justice. Since then, there are now like 15 different executive departments, but they are less, I don't want to say less important, but less, I guess, they have smaller domains. I want to do a video about Joe Biden's whole cabinet for February, so I will do that. But people that are yet to be confirmed, we have Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor. I'm going to omit the Secretary ofs now and just say the departments. Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. So I think you can understand what I mean compared to the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice. These are smaller, like more specific departments, executive departments. But yeah, so yeah, that's sort of a rundown of what's going on. And this is partially related to why the impeachment trial of Donald Trump is going to be in February, because the Senate and Joe Biden wants to get his cabinet picks appointed pretty quickly, which makes sense, just more pragmatic. Right now, what happens for all the other executive departments is that they have acting secretaries. So these people are allowed to, like, there's a set group of people for each executive department that Joe Biden was allowed to pick from to be their acting secretaries for each department. However, he would prefer his actual picks get to be secretary as soon as possible. So that's sort of what the Senate is worrying about right now. They're trying to balance the impeachment trial with the cabinet confirmations. And it's an interesting argument what should happen first. But yeah, so let's actually go to senators sworn in for impeachment trial. So this was on Monday, January 26th. The Senate was sworn in for the impeachment trial. And this is just a very strange impeachment trial, I will say. Everything about this is pretty interesting. So first of all, it's the second impeachment, and it's the first second impeachment. So that's like sort of new ground that's being tread. Also, that's a little strange is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, is not going to be presiding over this impeachment trial, which you might find strange because it actually says in the Constitution that the Chief Justice has to preside over the impeachment of the president. But I believe if you look at the wording, it actually says the sitting president, and Donald Trump, of course, is no longer the sitting president. So instead, it is Patrick Leahy, who is the president pro tempore of the Senate. He is going to be presiding over the impeachment. Let me pull up that section of the Constitution. Let's see. So, Article 2, Section 4. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Let's see. That did not cover what I would have liked it to cover. Let's see. Maybe the next section will. Here, wait. Okay, section 1, section... Huh. That's it. I guess it doesn't say in the Constitution that the Chief Justice... Maybe I'm mistaken. Let me try to verify this. Constitution, Chief Justice impeachment. I'm pretty sure this was... So, yeah, I don't know about this. Oh, here we go. Article 1, Section 3, it looks like. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments, but no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of members present. So this is throughout the Constitution, it seems. Chief Justice. There we go. Okay. So here it is. Here's the official thing I found it. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So it doesn't say sitting president, but it also doesn't say, like, including former presidents. It just says when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. So that's an interesting question. I don't know how, it's murky. I could see it going to, like, the Supreme Court, but then the question is, you know, John Roberts is the Chief Justice. I don't know, this is complicated, but the point is, if this comes up in the future, then I'll cover it. That's essentially how it is. I cover things that have happened, right? So there's some weirdness there, but the point is, Chief Justice John Roberts will not be presiding over this impeachment trial. And yeah, it'll begin in February, and that's about it. If Donald Trump is convicted in the Senate, which would require 2/3 of the Senate to support impeachment, then he arguably would not be able to serve as president again, hold any public office. I believe it's after he gets impeached with a 2/3 majority, then a simple majority of the Senate can bar him essentially from public service again. And this is adherent to the 14th Amendment, which says that no people who have levied insurrection against the United States are allowed to hold public office again. And this was passed just after the Civil War. So this was primarily meant to prevent ex-Confederates from serving again. So that is sort of what is going to be used. So yeah, here we go. 14th Amendment, Section 2. It says, so, wow, this is long. So, but when the right to vote at any election for one choice, okay, I think that was about, here we go. So, to support the Constitution of the United States, okay. So, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of the President and Vice President or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to enemies thereof. So that is very long, but if you basically cut off the bits about senators and congressmen, because this is just about the president, this is basically saying that anyone that, while under constitutional oath, after taking the oath to uphold the Constitution, anyone that incited a rebellion against the United States is barred from serving in office again, which makes sense because essentially the problem during this time period was a ton of senators and congressmen from the South had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, and then when their states decided to secede from the Union, they sided with their states. Almost all of them. It's interesting. Andrew Johnson was the only senator from a state that turned Confederate that sided with the Union. And he would later become president and be impeached himself. So that's interesting. But yeah, he was not a very popular, not a very good president. But anyway, the point is that if the Senate determines that Donald Trump is guilty of inciting an insurrection, that would also apply to the 14th Amendment. On top of impeaching him, it would say, you are under oath as president, and you violated that oath by inciting an insurrection, so you can no longer hold public office. So that would be an interesting political play. It's really up to the GOP, to the Republicans in the Senate. Of course, the Democrats are going to vote for impeachment, but it is uncertain whether the Republicans will. During the last impeachment, there were two articles presented, and one of the articles was just entirely down partisan lines. The 47 Democrats voted to impeach, or to convict, and the 53 Republicans voted to acquit. So he was acquitted on that one. And then the second article of impeachment, was almost entirely party lines. It was 48 to 52. The one difference was Mitt Romney, who was a Republican, voted in favor of conviction and sort of defied party lines there. So this time around, it really is up to, can the Democrats and the prosecutors drum up support from at least 17 Republicans to decide to convict Trump? And that's really up to whether or not the Republicans want to keep him and his supporters as part of their party, and that's just more of a political game. So here we're focusing on just, the policy and just government actions, but, then you get into party politics, and party politics can be pretty interesting. But yeah, so that's sort of the... Oh, and another thing, if Donald Trump gets convicted, then a ton of the benefits that former presidents get, he would no longer be allowed to have. For instance, every former president gets Secret Service, continues to protect them. Donald Trump would have to hire his own security personnel. I believe there are like health care plans, like there's a ton of different things that former presidents get. And if Donald Trump gets impeached, then he would not be allowed to have those. Of course, he is also very wealthy with a net worth of $2 billion, so most of the things he'll be denied he can probably get anyway, just with money. That is the nature of being wealthy, right? So, yeah, so this is just an interesting sort of thing. He's not in office anymore, so some people might find it strange to impeach him, but as I just laid out, an impeachment, like a conviction here, would remove a ton of benefits that he would receive as a former president, and it would make it impossible for him to become president again or serve in the Senate or the House or any other office in the United States. So this is actually significant. There is actually reason for this, even though he is out of office and has already essentially been removed from office by Joe Biden. So while it may not seem to make sense in the sort of traditional idea of impeachment, which is to remove someone who is disastrous, like remove a disastrous incumbent, for opponents of the president, this very much makes sense. So yeah, it really just depends how many people and which people decide that they either support or do not support the ex-president. So yeah. But that will start February 9th, and that is it for this month in the legislative branch. So yeah, that was pretty sparse, I would say. I imagined when I sort of embarked on this project, I imagined that the legislature would be doing a lot more than it actually turned out that it did. And I imagine that is just a combination of the sort of political turmoil that has gone on and just the fact that it is the start of a legislative session, so things are naturally slower at the start. But yeah, there's been a ton of crazy, crazy things that are unofficial, that are not part of the government's operation that have been going on. And I imagine that sort of slows down government operation. Like currently, you have some of the more notable, like popular, like celebrity almost type, like senators and congress people are arguing with each other on Twitter, right? That's sort of kind of like childish bickering. It's funny. I feel like there would be a lot of relief if just politicians were not allowed to use Twitter, right? But yeah, so a ton of just crazy things happening outside of the legislature that it sort of makes it hard to get stuff done within the legislature. It makes sense. I believe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Cori Bush, two Democratic congresswomen, decided or are promoting the idea of expelling Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley from the U.S. Senate, which is something that, again, these are functions that the Congress and the House can do. And interestingly, again, they were used primarily after the Civil War because a ton of ex-Confederates had gotten elected to, Congress and the Senate, and the other congressmen and senators were like, we do not want you here. You were rebelling against the United States. So this is in the Constitution. They're allowed to do it. But it does sort of make sense that this would slow things down because there's a lot of political fighting going on, not much policy making. But yeah. On another note, someone who is doing a lot of policy making is Joe Biden. So Joe Biden was inaugurated on January 20th, 2021. And since then, in the 9 days since then, he has signed 25 executive orders and many more presidential memoranda and presidential proclamations. But specifically looking at executive orders, this is interesting because 25 executive orders, just when you think about that for context, Barack Obama, during his first term in 2009, it took him until October of 2009 to sign 25 executive orders. Donald Trump took until April of 2017 to sign 25 executive orders. Joe Biden has done it in 9 days, which has given me a lot of work for this YouTube channel. But what it also means is that Joe Biden is taking a lot of swift actions to just get his administration going quickly, fulfill his campaign promises, which is, depending on if you like him or not, you can either say it's refreshing or horrifying, right? It's refreshing in the sense that it's nice to have a politician that's actually fulfilling their campaign promises on week one. But of course, if you're an opponent and you don't like his policies, then it's horrifying because you don't like his policies. It's as simple as that. But something to consider here as well is the size and scope of the executive orders that he is signing. So he signed a lot of executive orders, but executive orders can be anywhere from a few paragraphs to just dozens of pages long. And most of the ones I've read are of the few paragraphs form. There was one that was fairly lengthy. It was about climate policy and foreign relations. So Joe Biden, if I haven't done the research, I haven't compared to Trump and Obama, like the average length of their executive orders. But it could very well be that these are shorter and like sort of less impactful executive orders, like more concise. That's possible because really it's just sort of arbitrary, the number of executive orders. There was one day, it was the second day of his presidency, where he signed 9 executive orders related to COVID. Those could have all just been wrapped up into one executive order, and that's the COVID executive order. So it's strange when you just look at the sheer number 25, but I bet if you dig into it a bit more, you might actually see like, oh wait, this isn't as frenzied as it may seem. Also, we are in a pandemic. This is a crisis, and it very much makes sense for the president to be taking executive action during a crisis. Personally, I feel like that is the primary role of the executive branch, is to act quickly in a crisis. For instance, in 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, George Bush very quickly, within a day, had to sign an executive order to give them relief, to provide relief to New Orleans. If that sort of relief had to go through the congressional process, that would have been devastating for the people of New Orleans because it would have taken weeks at best. First a bill has to be introduced in committee, then it has to go to floor consideration, then you have to get everyone together to do a vote, and then it has to go to the other chamber of Congress, and then the president has to sign it. That whole process takes too long. I think many Americans in the past year have been frustrated just at the slowness of the COVID relief packages, with Congress going very slowly with that. But it is important, it is definitely important that Congress, I will stress, is the primary legislator. It was the branch of government that was given the most power in the Constitution. And now it's sort of arguable which branch has the most power. But it's best when Congress is doing most of the legislating because it means that all of America is represented, from every different part of the country. The president is, very much just sort of one party. However, I mean, it's of course, it's an argument, right? There are arguments on both sides here because, again, it's a pandemic. And as I was saying, in a crisis, you do need swift action. So it makes sense that Joe Biden would be taking so many actions in his first few days in office. I expect that we'll see his number of executive orders level off as the days go on. He started off with 9 one day, 8 the next day, but then he lowered it down to 1 or 2 every day. I expect that'll fall to 2 or 3 a week, and then maybe 1 a week, and just be a sort of typical presidential fashion. However, if I don't see that, I'll report it because that would be sort of concerning to maintain this level of executive orders, to continue with this many executive orders just as status quo, I would say would be a problem. However, it's the beginning of his presidency. He wants to get things done fast, and he is dealing with a crisis. So it makes sense. We'll see what happens, right? But let's get into these executive orders more specifically. So day 1, executive orders 13,985 to 13,993. So this is where my color coordinating system comes into play again, and I have a few general categories. So let's begin with, and feel free to make use of the live chat. I forgot to say that, but yeah, I love to talk. If you guys have any questions, I can hopefully answer them. But Yeah, so red, which is not on screen now, but comes up later, is sort of Bill of Rights, sort of civil liberties issues. Orange is immigration policy. Yellow is regulatory / economic policy, sort of a miscellaneous category. Green is science and climate. Blue is COVID, and purple is sort of, I guess, civil rights, sort of like equality, equity issues, that sort of thing. So, yeah. So if you look here, we have a very broad array of executive orders for day one. And I feel like Joe Biden's 9 executive orders on day one were essentially a sort of roadmap. He was basically laying out the primary objectives of his administration. And my evidence for this is also that during his inauguration speech, he very much indicated similar ideas. So, yeah, I would say there are a few key points here. So, one thing that Joe Biden campaigned on and is now following up on is, civil rights issues for minorities, of racial inequality, as well as for gender identity, sexual orientation, just different types of like disadvantaged groups. Then another big point of his presidency is going to be immigration. And this, I would say, is really because Trump's main campaign issue was, of course, immigration. The whole build the wall thing, that whole phenomenon. Trump's main focus was immigration, and so as Biden is trying to reverse most of what Trump did, I will say that, but most of Biden's policies are contrary to what Trump's policies were. So, of course, immigration is now a significant part of Biden's agenda because it was a significant part of Trump's agenda. Then, of course, we have the COVID crisis, we have climate change, and then just regulatory sort of economic policy. Those are the 5 main things I see as Biden's agenda. So, let's begin with the first executive order was advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So this was addressing inequalities, inequities, and yeah, this was a big campaign issue for Joe Biden. Of course, with the events over the summer, the demonstrations in response to George Floyd's death, the demonstrations, like all that, Biden campaigned on that, right? And so this executive order basically directed departments to make sure that underserved communities are getting access to the support they need. Because a big problem is often that the federal government provides resources and people either don't know about it or something like some extenuating circumstance makes it so that they can't get access to it, even though there's nothing in the law saying they can't get access to it. Like, for instance, say that there is like a medical center across town, but a person doesn't have a car, right? There is nothing within the federal law saying that they can't have access to that resource, but they still aren't. And so this was sort of an attempt to lower that. And there's probably going to be, again, follow-ups. This is just sort of an outline. This is basically Biden going in a general sense, attacking the 5 sort of problems he sees, trying to get the 5 points of his agenda done, trying to just get the broad strokes out. That's what he's trying to do here. And he'll probably go into the specifics later. So the next one is ensuring a lawful and accurate enumeration and apportionment pursuant to the decennial census. So this is an interesting one. The Senate was, or census was a controversial sort of news story for a while. It's done every 10 years. That's for the, decennial. And the 2020 census, Donald Trump wanted to add a question to the census that would basically be, are you a U.S. citizen? Which seems innocuous enough. However, the concern is that it will cause illegal immigrants to avoid answering the census. And that is essentially a problem, Biden is arguing, because in the Constitution, it states that the census should count the just whole number of persons residing in an area. Let me actually get the text. Constitution text. But it doesn't mention, like, if those people are citizens or not. It doesn't mention if they are legal residents or not. And so, let's see. Okay, section 9. Let's see. Okay. So, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration. Oh, okay, wait, that's, I don't know where the census comes in then, like where it details how the census should operate. Apportionment, maybe? I'm just control F-ing this whole thing. Okay, so here's what it is. So it's representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 and 3/5 of all of the other persons. So that is the notorious 3/5 compromise that has been repealed. But the part about their respective numbers is still there. And you see, that is not incredibly specific, respective numbers. Let's see, that was repealed by the 13th Amendment? Or 14th? I don't know. But the point is, it just said numbers of free persons, which today is just literally anyone residing there. And whether or not you think that should be the case, it is still the argument that, according to the U.S. Constitution, illegal immigrants should be counted within the census and within the apportionment of representatives to the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. So this is a very contentious issue, I will say. It's very difficult because illegal immigrants, of course, cannot vote because they are not citizens. And so you would think that they shouldn't be counted in a census if they're not going to be voting. However, it doesn't work that way because the census also, different programs and services are apportioned based on that. But it's also a problem because, for instance, California is a state with a lot of illegal immigrants, and they have 55 electoral votes. They are on track to lose one, I believe. But if the census was counted excluding illegal immigrants, then California would lose 2 or 3. And now this begins to get into a sort of partisan realm because the question is, it tends to be Democrat states that vote for Democrats that have more illegal immigrants. So this counting of the census would benefit them, whereas Trump's counting of the census would benefit the Republicans. So then it gets into partisan issues. But I would say, based on my interpretation of the Constitution, I believe that Biden's executive order is closer to the literal meaning of the Constitution. However, whether that should be kept the same is sort of up to determination. I believe that it would be right, it would be more correct for the apportionment to be based on the number of citizens in a state. However, that isn't even how Trump's executive order would have functioned because, remember, the census counts people under 18, and of course people under 18 don't vote. It also counts felons, many of whom are barred from voting. So the census already counts people that aren't allowed to vote and includes them in the apportionment. So I just think both of these executive orders, I guess, aren't really ideal. However, Biden's is closer to just the Constitution and consistency. That would be my argument, but of course it's up to interpretation for everyone. So next, we have organizing and mobilizing the United States government to provide a unified and effective response to combat COVID-19 and to promote United States leadership on global health and security. So yeah, this is just the COVID one. I forget exactly what it was all about, but it was just sort of specifics. I remember the other COVID one better because it's very simple. But yeah, this is just sort of arranging Biden's plan to combat COVID. It's pretty simple. So next we have preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So this is another component of Biden's sort of desire to advance equity and sort of eliminate discrimination. And yeah, I mean, I read these a while ago, so I don't entirely remember all of them that well in terms of specifics, but the titles are pretty telling. I mean, it's pretty simple what it says, but let me actually pull this thing up. Executive order. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so this is a lot of, this calls on previous decisions as well as previous legislation to enforce sort of non-discriminatory practices. That's all. There's practices in education that want to be sort of restructured. There's there's a debate over school sports and, gendered bathrooms and locker rooms, and whether or not transgendered individuals should be allowed access to those resources of their choice. Biden, of course, is saying they should be allowed access, and that is part of this executive order because it calls on Title IX in education, which is, a law in education, and just other things. So yeah, this makes sense. Okay, so next we've got ethics commitments by executive branch personnel. This is a very pro forma executive order. Every president has this very early on, to my understanding. It's basically just an oath that workers of the executive branch have to take or sign. They have to agree to it before, becoming employed by the executive branch. It's just like a contract, really. It's a lot of stuff it's primarily about lobbying rules. It's saying if you work for the federal government under the executive branch, you are not allowed to be a lobbyist within X number of years. Trump's ethics commitment said you can't be a lobbyist for 5 years, which was pretty nice, but then he repealed it, so he reversed his own decision, strangely. And Biden did not reinstate that, but it still has some, I think it's like 2 years restriction on lobbying, so it's not like he just threw it out the window. It's just a debate on how long should you be barred from lobbying. But yeah, it's important, but yeah, it's pretty simple. It's just, it's ethics. We want individuals that when they enter the executive branch of government and once they leave it, to be behaving ethically. And this is just a contract. So this makes it so that they legally are not allowed to engage in activities we would consider unethical during or after leaving office, which is just wonderful. So next we have protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. So this was the first executive order relating to the climate that Biden had. And I mean, there's not much about it. It's just kind of simple. Part of it, or I think it might be a different presidential action, but something he did on the first day was begin the process of re-entering the Paris Climate Accords, which is, an international agreement that would hopefully help reduce the effects of climate change. Um, but yeah, oh yes, another thing, there's a lot of revocations in here. So a lot of the Biden executive orders, there's one executive order that just flat out just repeals 6 Trump executive orders, which it's like some people say like, oh, it's sort of, why is he just reversing everything Trump did? But I disagree with that. I think as a policy, executive orders should automatically expire once the president is no longer the president, or maybe 6 months after. That's what I say. I say every executive order should expire 6 months after the next president takes office, unless that president decides to renew them. And this is because, again, the way that I sort of view the executive branch is that it's meant to take decisive action on emergency issues that Congress would be too slow to address. Of course, it also is supposed to do other things, but basically, it's not supposed to legislate. That's why it's called the executive branch, not the legislative branch. So I think it would be a good idea for executive orders to just automatically expire at the end of a presidency. And basically, if you would have an objection to that, then you're straying from the purpose of the executive branch, right? If you say, no, I don't want this to be reversed, then I would say, then get Congress to pass it, right? Because this is sort of a problem. Like, one of the criticisms that people say is that it's arbitrary for Biden to be reversing all of Trump's executive orders. But then, of course, while Republicans say that now, Democrats said it's arbitrary for Trump to be reversing all of Obama's executive orders. So it's only arbitrary when it's not your favored person, right? It's a little hypocritical, is what I would say. But yeah, ideally executive orders would have a lesser role. However, it's just kind of crazy. Again, as I said, I think hopefully the number of executive orders will diminish so that the proper process for legislation can sort of be restored. Oh yes, part of this executive order was revoking the March 2019 permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. That was a pretty big thing. So this is interesting. This is an interesting issue. I think it caused some grief with Canada temporarily because it sort of was in violation of a contract we had with them, because 2,000 Canadians were hired for this big pipeline and 10,000 Americans. And by revoking the permit, Biden essentially got rid of those jobs, which people have criticized him for. However, ideally, we would be able to find a way, a different sort of field for these people, other jobs for these people. Hopefully, I hope these people can find jobs again. But the climate crisis is an important thing, and the Keystone Pipeline was not the best managed project. There were a lot of oil spills from it, but maybe you could argue that that means the pipeline should have been reformed rather than canceled. But it's been doing this for a while. It's been leaking for a while. So it is what it is. I feel like that should be the catchphrase of this show. It is what it is. This thing happened, right? That is the main point of the news. That is what I'm trying to report. So that's that. So next, we have protecting the federal workforce and requiring mask wearing. So this is a pretty simple one. This was basically just Biden saying anyone on federal property has to wear a mask. Any federal employee has to wear a mask. Pretty simple. This is sort of like he was saying during his campaign that he wanted to institute a 100-day mask mandate. And essentially, he's done that for federal workers and federal land, and he has encouraged it for everyone else. But the key thing is, people were criticizing him for it then, is that he doesn't actually have the authority to say all Americans must wear masks. That would go beyond the scope of the executive branch. However, he does have the authority to say the federal workforce must wear masks. So that's great. That's an effort to reduce the spread of the pandemic. So next, revocation of certain orders concerning federal regulations. That's what I was talking about before. Biden revoked like 6 Trump executive orders in one go, which I really don't have a problem with. Again, I feel like all executive orders should have a time limit attached to them. And really, the criticism, I would say, would be that he didn't reinstate those orders, if you liked those orders, right? This was a lot of, again, this was regulation. One of the orders, these were all Trump executive orders. One of them said, it was pretty interesting. It said, any executive department that proposes a new regulation must find 2 regulations to get rid of before passing the regulation, which was an effort to, of course, reduce regulation, because anytime a new regulation occurs, 2 have to go, which means that the number of regulations will decrease over time, which is consistent with just the sort of Republican platform of reduced regulation. But yeah, so Biden reversed that. He said in the executive order, like, a lot of these orders limited the capacity of the federal government and the executive branch to operate. And that's fair. I would say an executive order saying that you must remove 2 regulations every time you add a new one, that can only last so long. I mean, that's necessarily a temporary thing. Otherwise, eventually, you would just have no regulations, which some people would probably be a fan of, but that's not the point. The point is that was necessarily temporary, so it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it is also consistent with a more Democrat platform of desiring more regulation to keep things in check. So next we have revision of civil immigration enforcement policies and priorities. So this one actually, interestingly enough, while it contained more than just revocations, it revoked more Trump executive orders than the one that literally has revocation in its name. So this was, of course, a ton of Trump executive orders. One of them was Trump had an executive order that was basically targeting sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, which were cities and states that defied federal law and allowed illegal immigrants to stay within their borders and did not properly enforce immigration according to federal law. So Trump decided to crack down on that practice, and so Biden has reversed that action. So the states are allowed to, like California is a big one, they are allowed to sort of violate federal law, which, you see, I feel like if you don't like federal law, the onus should be on changing federal law rather than going against it. There's a lot of technical stuff here. It's really interesting. I'm just trying to take a very analytical perspective here, but I would say my biggest problem with most of what goes on with government right now is sort of abuse of power. And I don't mean from Biden, I just mean from everyone generally. There's a ton of situations. The executive branch, again, as outlined in the Constitution, the executive branch has sort of usurped power that Congress was supposed to take. But then again, Congress has to put up a fight. Congress has to sort of resist this usurpation of power, but they really aren't doing much of that. Congress is just sort of allowing the executive branch to overstep their bounds, which, it's like, I feel like we can debate about policy once the proper sort of order is in place, once institutions are functioning as intended. And again, like, the way I feel is that if you don't like how the institutions are currently structured, then you can change that via amendments, constitutional amendments. I just feel that there's a lot of it's rare, there is some, again with the sanctuary cities, there's some flagrant breaking of the law in the Constitution, but there's a lot of sort of just weaseling around the law and the Constitution. And ideally that would get sort of cleaned up in order to, I feel like it would help the functioning of the government, personally. But anyway, those were the first executive orders. So you can sort of see on day one what Biden's priorities are. But yeah, next we get to a ton of just COVID. All of these are about COVID. I gave this one a purple because it is COVID and it's about equity, so it's ensuring an equitable pandemic response and recovery. Basically, you've probably heard the statistic before about how communities of color are like twice as likely to be impacted by COVID, to die from COVID. So this executive order sort of covers both parts of, like, 2 points of Biden's plan, because it is intended to address inequities in the pandemic. So that's interesting. But yeah, all of this is just COVID stuff. Let's see, one of them, yes, supporting the reopening and continuing operation of schools and early childhood education providers. So that is about reopening schools, which is pretty interesting because that was a lot of, Trump was talking a lot about that in early 2020 about, like, oh, the schools should be open because, you know, the kids can get COVID. But he was of course being hyperbolic. I feel like that is I feel like that's unnecessary to say. Trump was being hyperbolic. He's always being hyperbolic. That's what I would say. You don't, like, saying he was being, you can just assume, you know, unless I say otherwise, right? He was being hyperbolic. But yeah, so Biden, I guess, has decided that now is an appropriate time to begin the reopening process. Of course, it isn't just simple reopen. It's also respect CDC guidelines while reopening. So, yeah, so that's a lot of what this is. There's also improving and expanding access to care and treatments for COVID. That is to try and extend COVID care to, you know, more impoverished individuals and just hard to reach places, essentially. But yeah, all of this is sort of Biden's COVID plan. Again, on my channel, I have read every single executive order here. I just don't necessarily remember all of them well. But if you want to check out the videos where I read them, you can get an idea of what's going on. But another thing is establishing the COVID-19 Pandemic Testing Board and ensuring a sustainable public health workforce for COVID-19 and other biological threats. Yeah, that's for proper testing so that we can get a good idea on how many people are sick, what the COVID numbers are, because those have been pretty inconsistent. It's been on a state-by-state basis, and some states have been better at collecting data than others. Then, of course, you have ensuring a data-driven response to COVID-19 and future high-consequence public health threats, which would sort of utilize the testing board's information to make smart policy decisions, which is great. And then promoting COVID-19 safety in domestic and international travel. I believe this is where Biden had there's a travel ban on 26 countries. It's mostly European countries because that is where, of course, in the UK, a new strain of the coronavirus popped up. And there's also a ton of safety regulation, CDC guidelines for planes, buses, trains, anything that the federal government can regulate. And then finally, you have a sustainable public health supply chain. That is very important because there have been some sort of supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. Some different, like, there were videos where farmers were just dumping produce just because they couldn't sell it, like, which sucks. You know, it's like a big waste. But then, yeah, protecting worker health and safety. This is interesting. This works through OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration / Act, which is supposed to protect, you know, workers' safety, make sure that people don't get hurt on the job, just regulates that sort of thing. And of course, with the pandemic, there are new regulations needed. So that's interesting. But yeah, that pretty much covers it, I guess. Again, this is specifics. This is Biden's policy. And it's interesting. A lot of these orders also mention the future. So they mention, let's get this set up now for the pandemic, but let's make sure that while we respond to this pandemic, we make sure that we are ready in case another pandemic occurs, which I would say is pretty smart. It's best to prepare. What is the quote? It's, if you fail to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So this is pretty smart policy making, I would say, because they are preparing for a future pandemic. So yeah, next, you can see an immense drop-off. Biden sort of calmed it down a bit. He gave his hand a break, right? His signing hand, right? So we've got economic relief related to COVID-19 pandemic and protecting the federal workforce. So protecting the federal workforce is an interesting one. Biden gave essentially, in this executive order, he gave the federal workforce a raise. I'm not sure if it was very absolute, but he said, like, look into giving them a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is, that's been a Democratic Party platform, has been giving everyone a $15 an hour minimum wage. But again, for the entire country, minimum wage is something that Congress has to set. So that's that. But Biden, for the federal workforce, he is allowed to say that the federal workforce must get $15 an hour. So yeah, so let's look at that. Protecting the federal workforce. I want to find the specific wording here. Yes, progress toward a living wage for federal employees. The director of OPM shall provide a report to the president with recommendations to promote a $15 an hour minimum wage for federal employees. So again, that is pretty, like, it's pretty loose, because I imagine if he just said every executive department must instantaneously give their workers a $15 an hour minimum wage, I imagine that would cause them to run out of appropriations money. So they have to do it intelligently, but it's a step in that direction. So that's sort of progress for that cause, if you're in support of that. But let's see. So yeah, executive order on economic relief related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, this makes sense. This is just sort of, as much as the president can, is trying to provide sort of relief to the economic disorder that has occurred around the country. Let's see. In doing so, should prioritize. Okay. So all executive departments and agencies shall promptly identify actions they can take within existing authorities to address the current economic crisis resulting from the pandemic. So this is pretty general. This isn't very specific, and I guess that's sort of what you could criticize this for. However, I think it is the most that Biden can actually do, because Congress has what's known as the power of the purse, which is they decide budget. They decide what to spend on, and basically Congress gives the executive department like a set allowance per year. So it's like they say, okay, your yearly allowance is whatever, $1 trillion or something like that, and the the executive branch can decide what to do with that money, but they only have limited funds. And there are laws about how they can do, but within existing laws, it's basically what they're trying to do is use money as smartly as possible. That's a lot of what's going on here. There's a lot of reshuffling funds and like administrative properties as much as is possible within the law, which I think is great, because as I said a little bit earlier, I criticized that the executive branch is taking up a bit too much power. I do very much like here that they're sort of respecting the role of Congress, and they're respecting the role of applicable law, which is wonderful. However, what it means here for this executive order, which is sort of the opposite of wonderful, is that it's not going to be as impactful in terms of relief. But hopefully Congress will get out a relief package very soon. I forgot to mention that, but they are currently working on that. It'll be hard to find the time between the cabinet appointments and the impeachment trial, but hopefully they can find the time to vote yes on another relief package for people. They're trying to get, like, Biden has been pushing this, so, of course, the legislative branch is also controlled by Democrats, so hopefully they'll listen to Biden. Biden has been urging them to get a relief package passed. He wants to give another $1,400 to people. So that's going to help a lot of people, I would say. But yeah, so this executive order specifically, I would say hopefully what it does is it allows for more efficient and more effective use of the funds that the federal government does have, or sorry, the executive branch does have. So if the executive branch is able to spend $100 billion on relief, for instance, and only 50 billion of it is actually getting to the people that need it, the other 50 billion is going to, administration, upkeep, all these different things. What Biden's trying to do here is say, no, let's get the majority of it, let's get as much as possible going directly to the people that need it, which is intelligent. So yeah. So next we have enabling all qualified Americans to serve their country in uniform and ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. So the first one here is relating to Donald Trump's policy, his administration's policy that refused to allow transgender individuals from serving in the American military, and Biden is just reversing that. I think it's like 2 executive orders here. Revocation. The Presidential Memorandum of March 23, 2018, and the Presidential Memorandum of August 25, 2017 are revoked. So those 2 presidential memoranda from Donald Trump basically barred transgender individuals from serving in the military. The concern was over, basically, it was 2 things. It was sort of like healthcare costs. I mean, of course, you could also argue that, I'm just stating the official reasons, but you could say there's ulterior motives involved here with, bigotry. But the stated reasons for Trump doing this was for healthcare costs for transgender individuals being higher than for other individuals. And at the start of Biden's executive order right here, he basically just says, according to this study, and this study, it actually isn't a significant increase in healthcare costs to include transgendered individuals in the military, so I am reversing this order. So that's that. So it is reversed. So transgender individuals can now serve in the military again. They are also allowed, they have been, like Biden has worked on, part of this executive order is that military personnel are supposed to look into people that have been dishonorably discharged so that they can get back into the military. So that's good. And so then the other one, ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers, that is, I love this one. This one is basically saying that the federal government, as much as possible, must buy American-made goods. So when you're at the store and you always, well, you don't always, but you ever check the tag and you see like, oh, made in China, made in Vietnam. It's always nice, like it's always a sort of patriotic type thing to get made in USA. Like it's fun to see that. And it's pretty good. This is basically just promoting domestic businesses, not necessarily small businesses, but I think domestic business more helps small business, I would say, which is great. It is also good because it'll stimulate the American economy a little bit, because the federal government does need to buy a lot of things from the private sector. And if they are buying them from other countries, then that money is going to other countries. So this executive order will stimulate the economy, which is, again, great. Just like the COVID economic relief package, this will help people out. So this is wonderful. What else about this? Yeah, it does mean that it might raise the costs of operation for the federal government, because made in America products tend to be more expensive than products made overseas, because overseas, China, India, Vietnam, people are paid a lot less for their work, which is also unfortunate. I think this is more consistent with Biden's his protecting the federal workforce policy, his desire to get a $15 an hour minimum wage for people, is that in America, there's not a $15 an hour minimum wage. Well, in some states there is, but The minimum wage is $7.25 nationally. Most states have more than that, but my point is that buying American-made products actually encourages an increased minimum wage because people in other countries are not paid a minimum wage. They are paid very low amounts, which is like very disappointing. And so hopefully this executive order would encourage other countries to step up their game a little bit in order to maybe get some good graces again, which would be nice, getting workers more money. That's good. So yes, so next we have reforming our incarceration system to eliminate the use of privately operated criminal detention facilities. I think this one surprised me the most to see, and it's got to be my favorite or one of my favorites because this is basically saying it's a very simple order. It is the Department of Justice shall discontinue or shall not renew any contract with a private prison company. So hopefully this will phase out the use of private prisons in the federal government, which is wonderful. The private prison system is a problem, I would say. And this doesn't entirely eliminate private prisons because there are still state prisons, and the federal government can't simply eliminate them with the snap of their fingers because they have contracts and they have to uphold their end of the contract, but this is phasing them out. And this is important because you have to think about profit incentives with a lot of these government policies. Allowing private prisons to operate essentially creates a profit incentive for people to be incarcerated. The private prison companies make more money when more people are in jail. And so just naturally, sort of with common sense, you might reason, oh, these private companies want more people to be in jail and will encourage more people to be in jail, which is not what we want. We have a problem with mass incarceration, but basically we don't want more people committing crimes because that is how people end up in jail. So these companies essentially have a profit motive for people to go commit more crimes, which is not a good thing to be actively encouraging. It's much better if the federal government is operating these prisons, not because I automatically think the government is so great. I tend to distrust both the government and the big corporations, but it's better in that their profit incentive is for people to be law-abiding citizens, so they don't necessarily want to keep people in prison as much. I think another sort of thing that needs to happen, but this would require a constitutional amendment, is amending the 13th Amendment, which says coerced labor or involuntary servitude, except in the case where someone has been duly convicted of a crime, is illegal in the United States. That except part, that clause, is a big problem because it allows prisoners to be coerced into labor. It was a much bigger problem just after the Civil War. However, it's still a problem today, is that prisoners can be forced to do labor and they're paid very little, much below minimum wage, like $1 an hour. And that is a profit incentive. That encourages the government to keep people in prison for the sake of the cheap labor, which is bad. So hopefully that would get amended as well. But this is a great step in the right direction, in my opinion, in sort of reforming our incarceration system. There is a lot of different things that need to happen in the justice system. I am no expert, but I do know a lot about just simple economics. I'm a fan of economics. That's actually, I was debating between making a second channel about government things or economics things. I went with government things because I don't yet know that much about economics, but I really want to study it. So once I know more about that, maybe I'll start a third channel. But my point is, it's very simple to think if a company has a profit incentive to do something, then they will do it. And private prisons creates a profit incentive for companies to keep people in jail. So naturally, they will attempt to keep people in jail, which is not ideal. So bravo, this is a great executive order. All right, next, so we have two science ones. First, we have establishment of the President's councils of advisors on science and technology, and then we have tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. So the first one is the president is creating a council about science and technology. And now this is interesting because I remember Andrew Yang, who was a presidential hopeful, I remember he wanted Biden, I remember seeing a news clip where he wanted Biden to create a new executive department, like Department of Technology or something, so that he could be the Secretary of Technology. So maybe he'll serve on this committee, I don't know, but maybe not, because I think he's running for mayor in New York City. So we'll see what happens there. But this is great. This council is essentially supposed to advise the president on all things science, which is wonderful. I am very much a fan of this as well. My main channel, GovernMax, is all about science. I love science. I've always said I think we need more scientists in politics. We need more science in policymaking. And I think this is a great step in the right direction to have just a science council. It's great. It means that hopefully more policy decisions will be decided on the facts of the situation rather than sort of virtue signaling or posturing or any other sort of political tool that is used to make policy, right? So I think this might be very good for the future. But also interesting is that there are other councils that have been established by law that this council will sort of take the place of. One of them is the High Performance, there's the High Performance Computing Act of 1991 says that there has to be a committee on innovation and technology. So Innovation and Technology Advisory Committee, this new committee doubles as that. And then also it doubles as the National Nanotechnology Advisory Panel. Now, I did not know about this, but let me read this to you. So this is section 4 or subsection 4. This is the council will serve as the advisory panel identified in section 4 of the 21st Century Nanotechnology Research and Development Act, Public Law 108-153, in which capacity the PCAST, that's the council, shall be known as the National Nanotechnology Advisory Panel. I'm a big fan of nanotechnology, I will say. I love it in movies. I use it in my first book. My first book, the ending, is very much related to nanotechnology. And my second book, nanotechnology is used all throughout. So this sort of made me excited when I read it. Of course, this is not a new thing. This is Public Law 108, so that's the 108th Congress, and then number 153. So this is from many years ago, so I want to look into that more. But because nanotechnology is pretty cool. So I like this executive order. It's all about it's all about science advisory, right? And then the next executive order is tackling the climate crisis as at home and abroad. And the abroad part is sort of what I want to focus on here, which is very interesting. This executive order decides to tackle climate change in a foreign relations aspect. This is the lengthy one I talked about. This is the longest executive order of Biden's by far. But and so I haven't read all of it, but it outlines in the beginning that the U.S. should use foreign relations as a way to handle climate change, which I think is very intelligent because we can sort of wield our influence on the world stage to influence other countries' climate policies. For instance, I think next to the U.S., or actually no, I think the U.S. is the second greatest contributor to carbon emissions after China. So hopefully this will figure out how to deal with that. And yeah, I think it's intelligent because we can make all the laws that we want here about climate change. But if we were to press this through foreign relations to say, you know, the aid that we want to provide your country, like that could be one thing. Like we will provide more aid to countries that reduce their carbon emissions, or we will reduce tariffs to countries that reduce their carbon emissions, things like that. Foreign relations can be used as a tool to shape policy around the world. I mean, it's as simple as that. And since climate change is a global issue, it makes sense that this executive order would sort of address it from that standpoint. So it's very interesting. All right, so next we have strengthening Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. This revokes Trump's first executive order, which was minimizing the, I forget the exact title. It was minimizing the economic burden of the Affordable Care Act pending repeal. It never got repealed, so the pending repeal part is since outdated, right? So this basically just reverses that. Trump did get through, he repealed the personal mandate, or well, it was really Congress. They repealed the personal mandate, which required people to purchase insurance or else pay a fine. But this is sort of reversing that, of course, because, you know, the Affordable Care Act was sort of Obama's signature legislation. And of course, Biden was part of that administration. So he is, I mean, it says it right there, strengthening the Affordable Care Act. So again, whether or not you think that's a good thing, you know, that's beyond me, right? So yeah, that's essentially what that is doing. Trump was sort of trying to, with his executive orders, within the law, he was as much as possible trying to reduce the impact of the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid, whereas Biden, as much as he can within the law, is going to try to increase the impact of these programs. So that's sort of, again, this is just a sort of, I enjoy the executive branch keeping to its station, saying, okay, the established law gives me a range of options that I can do, so I will pick my favorite option within that range. That is essentially what this is doing. And that is what Trump had done, except this is just doing it in a different way because, of course, Biden is a Democrat and Trump was a Republican. So, I mean, he still is a Republican, I'm pretty sure. He said, I heard things about there's going to be a third party, but like, again, we'll get to that if that ever happens, right? But yeah, Trump is still a Republican. I said was, but he was a Republican president. There you go. So he's still a Republican, but no longer president. Anyway, so I focus on executive orders on my channel, but there are also things known as presidential memoranda, which are slightly different. I'm not exactly sure how. It's kind of confusing. I like looked into it, and I forget. It was like not very specific, like what's within the range of an executive order, what's within the range of a memoranda. But let's just look at the titles here. So we've got Preserving and Fortifying Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. Of course, that is, you know, the Dreamers. This would be an immigration policy thing. Trump, I imagine, well, so this is really interesting. DACA originally was an executive order from Obama. Trump signed an executive order that revoked DACA. However, I forget who, but someone filed an injunction. It went to the Supreme Court, and Trump's executive order was deemed, I forget what it was deemed, but it was not allowed to happen. You know, I forget on what grounds. But the point being is that so DACA was an executive order from Obama. Trump tried to revoke that executive order, but was blocked from doing so. However, I imagine that since he couldn't explicitly revoke it, he probably had a few other executive orders along the way that were meant to weaken it. So Biden was just reversing that, trying to strengthen it instead, similar to the last executive order about the ACA. So then we have reinstating deferred enforced departure for Liberians. Uh, I mean, it pretty much says it right there. Liberia is a country in Africa that is related to America. I believe it was colonized by like freed slaves, um, which is interesting. I don't know the exact history of Liberia, but I know that it has a closer relationship. If you look at the Liberian flag, it looks very similar to the American flag. So Liberia has a closer relationship with America than the average African country. So next we have modernizing regulatory review. Again, I don't know the specifics there. Then we have memorandum to extend federal support to governors' use of the National Guard to respond to COVID-19 and to increase reimbursement and other assistance provided to states. Let's see. So to extend federal government support. Okay, so I guess some governors have been using the National Guard to distribute the vaccine, I believe, that has been going on. So this is just trying to help that. So next we have condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. That is in relation to COVID. There has been a lot of sort of ignorance and intolerance because COVID came from China. So then people just go down to their basest instincts and think, oh, that must mean everyone from China. And like, not even people from China, people from other Asian countries. Anyone from Asia is just automatically associated with the coronavirus. So this is sort of condemning that. I'm not sure exactly what it does because, again, like, Biden can condemn it all he wants, but people are still going to be intolerant. So I don't know what specifically it does. I think specifically it said sort of condemning the president, the former president. I'm so used to calling Trump the president because for the longest time he was, but he is no longer the president. So this is specifically one of the things in here is that they rail against his use of the phrase China virus, which is what he was calling COVID for a while. At one point he called it Kung Flu, which was like an internet joke. So just sort of, again, Trump talks too much, I would say. He talks way too much. And so this is going against that, trying to sort of calm down the rhetoric that he sort of inflamed, and hopefully that will actually reduce the amount of discrimination occurring right now because a lot of people get inflamed by the president, and I'm not sure how much sway Biden has over Trump supporters, right? Because again, very partisan, but hopefully this can actually reduce the discrimination that's going on. So next we have redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. This is just about, when the government does an affordable housing project, they want to make sure that it's, done in accordance with, equity. This is in relation to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, once, I forget who that was, but once that person gets appointed, they'll probably have to look at this memorandum and act upon it. So next we have tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships. So yeah, that's about Native Americans. That's about tribal government. The interaction between the federal government and the Native American tribal governments is very interesting. It's a very complicated relationship. It's different than the relationship between the federal government and the states and different from municipalities. It's its own unique thing that has developed over time. But yes, then we have restoring trust in government through scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking. This is another one relating to the executive order a while back, which is, science in policymaking. I very much love that because I am an aspiring scientist. I am not yet a scientist. I don't have any degrees or anything, but I intend on being one, and I like to see stuff like this. So then we have protecting women's health at home and abroad. So of course, this is mostly in relation to abortion rights and that sort of thing. So that's, controversial, but this would obviously, Biden as a Democrat would be in support of sort of increasing access to abortion and other birth control options as well at home and in foreign nations. So that is what this does. It intends to, abortion is the most extreme, but there's also other birth control options that this is promoting. So yeah, there's that. So then we have, this is supposed to say proclamations, but it says memoranda. So proclamations, everybody. This is supposed to be proclamations. First is a National Day of Unity. Biden wanted to call a National Day of Unity on Inauguration Day because of all the divisiveness, which I feel like is sort of like, it's good. It's just like, it's how do you exactly put it? It's like seeing a very futile effort, I guess. It's sort of sad because I feel like everything is so divisive right now that a ton of people are calling for unity. I mean, even like, Mitch McConnell in the Senate at one point said unity. So people are calling for unity, the politicians, but it's sort of unfortunate because it's largely like the politicians, a lot of them have drummed up this divisiveness, and then they say they want to cool it down. And it's sort of like they've let the genie out of the bottle, and they're having trouble like keeping that back down. But, I do genuinely hope that this National Day of Unity and any other policies in the future cause more unity to occur. Of course, on this National Day of Unity, January 20th on Wednesday, I did not feel that there was a lot of unity going on, let me just say. But I hope that in the future there will be, so there's that. So then we have ending discriminatory bans on entry to the United States. So this is related to Trump's travel ban from countries, many Muslim majority countries, but also like Venezuela and North Korea. But then, the list sort of changed over the course of the Trump presidency, but countries on there included Libya, I think Syria, Yemen, so those sort of countries. So yeah, Biden reverses that, saying that they were discriminatory. I think Venezuela and North Korea were the only two countries that were not Muslim majority countries on that list. So yeah, again, it's up to interpretation because of course, the official stated reason, this is like back to the transgender people in the military. The official stated reason is, counterterrorism or in national security or whatever, but we have no idea what's going on inside someone's mind, right? So the ulterior motive could actually be bigotry. We, of course, don't know, but Biden is asserting that he's asserting that it's discriminatory, which I would say is true because it is discriminating against certain countries. But whether or not you believe that is justified is a different question, right? So yeah, but it reverses that, so people can travel to and from those countries now. Next, we have termination of emergency with respect to the southern border of the United States and redirection of funds diverted to border wall construction. So Trump, back in a few years ago, I forget, but he declared a state of emergency at the southern border so that he could use the U.S. military to build the border wall and use their funding and their sort of labor to construct the border wall. So Biden is just reversing that, saying, don't do that anymore. There is not an emergency at the southern border anymore, and the funds are going to be diverted elsewhere. So the construction of the wall has been discontinued, essentially. That's what that was. Yeah. I mean, that was essentially, that was Trump's, as I said, that was his main campaign issue, right? So this is sort of reversing that, which is probably pretty smart because the wall project, I think, just got enormously expensive as well as just not being incredibly effective because a lot of illegal immigrants are people who have overstayed their visas. So I think it's like 44% is that case. So a wall wouldn't really stop these people from entering the country because they're already given authority to enter the country. They just don't leave when they're supposed to. So, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what immigration policy, in his place Biden wants to enact, but we'll see, right? So then we have suspension of entry as immigrants and non-immigrants of certain additional persons who pose a risk of transmitting coronavirus disease 2019. I believe this is the one that is actually a travel ban to a ton of European countries because of the new strain of COVID. But yeah, that's that. It makes sense because, I mean, it's just what Trump did at the beginning by restricting, I think, banning travel from China on actually exactly 1 year ago, January 29th, 2020. So we are on the anniversary of Trump banning travel from China over COVID. Can you believe that? It has been so long, like the pandemic has been going on for so long, that it's been 1 year since we restricted travel from China. Anyway, this is doing a very similar thing for Europe because the new COVID strain is there. So yeah. All right, so now we got the judicial branch. Well, actually, before we get into that, let me just say for the executive branch, for the next month, expect to see fewer executive orders, and that's it. I mean, that's really all they do, just executive actions. So fewer executive actions, I would say, is what to expect. I really hope Congress steps up. Congress, I would say, did not do enough this month. I mean, it sort of makes sense why they didn't get much done this month, but it's sort of sad. Gridlock. That's the age-old, stereotype congressional gridlock all the time. But we'll see. So judicial, the Supreme Court issued 2 opinions this month and heard 6 different cases. So I think one of them was like a double header thing, like it was 2 in 1. But yeah. So I read the opinions. I but I've looked into the opinions more than I've looked into the cases. But once the cases get opinions released on them, which will be in a few months, I'll talk about them more. But I'll go over them briefly right now. But so first we've got opinion. Chicago versus Fulton is vacated and remanded. So this case was about this guy, Fulton, went bankrupt, but his car was being held by the Supreme Court. Or no, sorry, not that. It was being held by the city of Chicago. So his car had been towed by the city of Chicago and was impounded essentially, and he had to pay a fine, he had to pay a fee to get his car back. But he filed for bankruptcy, and he says, well, I'm bankrupt. And when you're bankrupt, it essentially absolves you of your debts, and except for student loan debt, but all the other debts, a lot of them, by essentially taking your property, turning it into an estate, selling it off, and repaying your debtors to the greatest degree possible. And Fulton is just arguing that he should receive his car back as either part of the estate or just in general, because he's bankrupt, he can't pay the fines, so he should get his car back. I think what happened was the 5th Circuit or 7th Circuit decided, he should get his car back, but then the Supreme Court vacated and remanded it, which essentially reversed the decision and said, no, he did not deserve his car back. So, yes, let's see, succeed. Oh, I didn't, but yeah, so, sorry, I'm just looking into this. Yeah, so this vacated and remanded, he now doesn't get his car. But this establishes legal precedent, so this is all about the bankruptcy code of the United States, because the basic premise was that there was an earlier section of the bankruptcy code was in contradiction with a later section that like had been more recently amended. So the question was how to interpret the bankruptcy code. And they decided in this instance it's the automatic stay process. And so they decided that, you know, in this sort of situation where someone has impounded something, they do not have to give it back when you go bankrupt. So, yeah. So then next we have Henry Schein Incorporated versus Archer and White Sales Incorporated. This was a antitrust lawsuit. So this was about, this was in Texas. This was about the Sherman antitrust law, which goes back to 1890. It's crazy that we haven't had another. I mean, we probably have had another, but like, I don't know why we keep going back to that one. I think we need more antitrust laws. But also the Texas Free Enterprise and Antitrust Act. Oh yes, so basically, this Henry Schein Incorporated was sort of going to sue Archer and White Sales Incorporated, but then they decided to enter arbitration for certain topics, for certain things. But Henry Schein argues that he did not enter arbitration for every single like issue, for the whole issue. And so now he's suing, and it's sort of about what is the role of arbitration here. And so the Supreme Court is dismissing it. So they dismissed it, which basically says that it's up to arbitration. You know, so they were deciding in favor of Archer and White, I suppose, saying, yeah, this is up to arbitration. This is not for us to deal with. You decided to enter arbitration, so we're not going to touch this. That sort of thing. All right. So now we have cases heard. So the cases heard, we have Albence versus Guzman Chavez. So this is related to this is immigration. So this is related to immigration law. It was about, I think it's related to asylum seekers, and of course I will have more about this once there is a decision for it. But then in red we have, I do not know how to pronounce that, but you see it. It's in red, and it's there. And something weird just happened. Okay, there we go. What it argues, this case, is this is about some college students that are arguing that their college in Georgia has violated their freedom of speech because they were, you know, they're religious, more like religious college students, and they were saying, you know, they were holding events. I read into this a little bit, but they were, you know, they got permission to hold an event, but then the like scope of the event was determined to be more than what they had asked for. But they are suing, saying that the college had violated their freedom of speech. So next we have AMG Capital Management LLC versus the Federal Trade Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission was it was created by Woodrow Wilson. I'm on like in U.S. history right now. I am currently in the Wilson administration. Like that's where in history we're at right now. So that's why that's like fresh in my mind. But the FTC essentially sued these people. I forget why. I think it's yes. So it was about they weren't providing proper consumer protections. And yeah, that's sort of what it is. So then we have FCC versus Prometheus Radio Project and National Association of Broadcasters versus Prometheus Radio Project. Yeah, so this radio project was sort of, it was essentially, the argument was that they were being discriminatory by like not, I forget the specific reason why, but you know, different, like I think it was women and minorities were not receiving, you know, meaningful access, like the same access as other people. Let's see, so let's read this. This is from Ballotpedia. They say, the Federal Communications Commission issued modifications and orders following its 2016 quadrennial review. Oh, What happened? A problem occurred with the web page. Okay. Rules governing ownership of broadcast media under the Communications Act of 1934 and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. A group challenged several of the FCC's rule changes before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. The Third Circuit held that the FCC had not sufficiently considered the rule changes' effect on women and minority-owned media. Oh, okay, so this is actually the reverse. This is saying not the Prometheus Radio Project, but the FCC, they hadn't made proper consideration for these minority groups in terms of their new legislation, and they're sort of suing. So, again, interesting. So next we have, yes, this one. BP PLC versus Mayor and City Council of Baltimore. So this is pretty simple. This is Baltimore is actually suing this company for pollution and for their contribution to climate change. It's as simple as that. So we'll see what the court decides on that. But yeah, that's it. Conclusion. I am tired. But that has been the last month in politics and government. That has been what the government has been up to. So I would say, just like in review, Congress has not been doing enough, and hopefully we'll see them doing more in the coming month. And I would say Joe Biden's level of executive action, if it were to maintain at this high level, would be concerning. However, it is understandable for his first week in office, right? So I'm going to give him that concession, right? But yeah, and then the Supreme Court just sort of does its thing. It's sort of, the Supreme Court is like, I don't want your drama, other branches of government. I don't want your drama. I just want to do my thing. I'm just going to listen to court cases and make opinions. The Supreme Court is kind of nice. They're like trying to stay out of it. But then whenever a justice resigns or passes away, then it becomes a big political thing over, oh, you can't nominate this person. Yes, I can, blah, blah, blah. And then they get sucked into the drama and they're sad. But for the most part, they get to stay out of the drama, which is nice. I just like that. I just find that funny. But yeah, so the legislative branch and the executive branch, oh boy, lots of drama. My coverage to myself, I'm like, this seems pretty scant just in terms of what has happened in the past month. But it's actually not, just because of what I'm focusing on. You know, I'm not going into the, I don't even know what to call it. Different people are calling it insurrection, riots, whatever. The violence at the Capitol, I didn't cover, I covered impeachment because that's actually a process. I didn't cover the most recent thing, which is occurring right now, which is like this strange Wall Street thing with the stocks to the moon, the Wall Street, r/Wall Street bets on Reddit, essentially inflating the price of the GameStop stock, initiating a short squeeze to make a ton of hedge funds lose a ton of money. I think it's possible there might actually be some legislation in relation to that in the coming month. Actually, I forget when, like a day or two ago, Biden's press secretary, Psaki, was asked whether she was aware of the Wall Street situation, and she said that the administration was keeping an eye on it. So we'll see. Something might happen in the coming month relating to that. It might happen very soon, but I'll cover it, I'll read any laws or executive orders that pass, and I'll cover it in the February edition of this live stream. But yeah, it is interesting with the Wall Street thing, because Ocasio-Cortez has already has tweeted about it. Cruz has tweeted about it. Warren has tweeted about it. I think Tlaib has tweeted about it. So like everyone's tweeting about this, which like that's the primary form of communication with our politicians now. But we'll see if anything gets done in relation to this strange, unprecedented Wall Street thing. But anyway, I'm very glad to have shared this Friday evening with you all. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I helped inform you about what is going on with the government. And I hope that you found it refreshing to take a closer look at policy and action rather than just the sort of day-to-day tribalist kind of politicking that goes on. That's the focus of this channel, I would say, is to promote discussions about policy rather than politics. That is the sort of key thing here. Because, again, as I said at the start, I think that Republicans and Democrats, I think that Americans in general actually agree about a lot more than they think. It's just that a lot of the politicians have been very divisive with each other, and a lot of different personalities have been very divisive with each other. But if we actually get down to it and try to have a good faith argument about it, I think we can have some very good discussions of policy. And that actually, I do hope to get some guests in the future. This is sort of, I am the only host of this podcast, right? Whereas my other podcast is co-hosted, but just like how my other one is co-hosted and we have guests, I'm the only host here, and I also hope to bring on guests. So maybe I can have some actual interesting dialogue with someone about 1 month's policy. That would be very fun. But yeah, so thank you all for watching. No one made use of the live chat, but again, if you want to ask any questions, feel free for the next time. And we can discuss policy, we can discuss current events. That's the point of this channel and this live stream. So with that being said, thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you, actually pop over to GravMax on Sunday. I can see you guys on Sunday. If you guys enjoy science, if you guys enjoy astronomy in particular, that's what we're talking about. So I would highly recommend that you, if you aren't coming from GravMax, then of course you know this, right? But if you are coming to this channel, this is my second channel, so I would highly recommend you go check out my primary channel. But if you aren't interested in that and you just want to stick with this channel, then thank you for watching. I will see you in the next month. Bye-bye.